Hey, good morning, everyone. We are on Mem Vav Amud Beis. So, if you recall, one of the questions that we were dealing with yesterday was this seemingly repetitive statement by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, on the one hand, said, when it comes to all Hilchos Eruvin, we go with the lenient view. And then he also said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in our Mishnah. And we were wondering why he has to say both. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in our Mishnah was a lenient view, right? Because what was he talking about? He was talking about a case where a person falls asleep when, outside the city. And the question is, do you have 2,000 amos, which is the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, or does he have 4 amos, which is the view of the Chachamim? And so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And he also elsewhere said we always go with the lenient view. So why does he have to say both? And we had different answers. So here we're going to see 2 more possible answers. So Rav Papa Amar Itzrich. It was necessary for Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi to state both that we follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and his other statements about going with the lenient view. Why? You would have thought that when he said we always go with the lenient view, hanimili be'eruve chatzeros. That is specific to eruve chatzeros. Again, what is eruve chatzeros? That's when you have courtyards that are adjacent one to another, and you make an eruv connecting them one to another. Right? We had this case in our Mishnah. We had 3 courtyards side by side, and you want to carry between them. So you make an eruv, you make some form of connection between them. There, the halacha. So anything to do with eruve chatzeros. Anytime you're making an eruv for a chatzer, and you have a machlokes, there Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was saying you go with the lenient view. However, aval be'eruve tchumin emalo. But when it comes to eruv tchumin, maybe we don't go with the lenient view, tzricha, and therefore he needed to say that although he elsewhere said that the law follows the more lenient view, he had to say that we follow the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now, the Gemara asks, "Umatemra shanilan ben eruv chatzeros lebeit tchumen." Where do we see that there be any reason to differentiate between eruv chatzeros and tchumen? In other words, once Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said the halacha is like the lenient view by Eruvin, why would you think to distinguish between eruv chatzeros and eruv tchumen? Lenient is lenient by Eruvin. Why would you think to distinguish? And the Gemara proves from one particular case that we do find that we are more lenient by eruv chatzeros. Why? It's not as taught in the Mishnah. We're going to see this in a little while. That Amrav Yehuda, and the Mishnah over there is talking about that you could set up an eruv without someone's knowledge or consent. Okay, so you're allowed to set up 4, right? So, which, by the way, right? Did you agree to the eruv being set up in Baltimore? No, you did not. Someone did it on your behalf, right? It was done on your behalf. So the Mishnah says it can be done without a person's consent. Rav Yehuda though qualifies that. He says the medvar murim. When is this true? Be'eruve. The Mishnah said that you. Sorry, the Mishnah says the opposite. The Mishnah says you do need consent. Okay, the Mishnah says you do need consent. But medvar murim. When is that said? Rav Yehuda. Sorry, Rav Yehuda. Medvar murim. When is that? Be'eruve tchumen. You need consent by eruve tchumen. Aval be'eruve chatzeros ma'arvin bein ladas uvein shlamadas. When it comes to an eruv chatzeros, like the eruv we have, an eruv in our town, there you don't need consent. Why? What's the difference? Why do we differentiate between eruv chatzeros, the fact that you're allowed to carry in the city, which was set up without your consent, as opposed to eruv tchumen, which needs your consent? Shezachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, ve'ein chavin la'adam ela b'fanav. There's a principle that you're allowed to benefit a person even without them being around. You can't do something to someone's detriment without them being around or without their consent. In other words, if I'm walking down the streets and I find an object which is hefker, and I say, someone, someone that I know would really love this object. I know it's completely hefker with knowing the rules of what an object is. And I say, my friend Bob would really love this object. I pick it up and I say, I'm acquiring this on behalf of Bob. I'm allowed to do that. That's zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, right? Because, and the principle is that, well, part of the principle is a whole discussion, but the idea is that since I know they would want it, I'm allowed to do it on their behalf. If it's something, if I pick up if I can't do something which would possibly be to their detriment. So let's think about eruv chatzeros and eruv tchumen. Eruv chatzeros means I'm allowed to carry in this area. It's only beneficial, right? There's no downside to being able to carry. It doesn't force me to carry. I can carry if I want. I cannot carry if I don't want. So eruv chatzeros, where generally there is a leniency and a more general leniency in the sense that it's something which is beneficial to all involved. Eruv tchumen, there is a benefit, but there's also detriments, right? Because we've touched on this. I just want to make sure we're clear about this, and that is that in Baltimore right now, all of us have a tchum 2,000 amos in every direction. Great. Now, let's say I set up an eruv tchumen, right? Let's say I want to go from Baltimore to Haver to Grace, as you all said, Havre de Grace. And I want to set up an eruv tchumen. So let's pretend it's outside the tchum. Hay over the grass. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so in a situation where I want to go there, let's pretend it's outside the tchum. I have no idea, and so I set up a tchum in that direction, like on the in the 695 direction, or whatever it is. And what does that allow me to do? So now I set it at the edge of the 2,000 amos. Fine. So I'm allowed to go in that direction and go further in that direction. But what that also does is that it removes my tchum in the regular 2,000 amos in the opposite direction, because now my starting point is there. Right? So now my starting point is now I cannot leave the city going in the opposite direction. Whereas right now, had you not set up the Eretz Chumen, I'd be allowed to go in the opposite direction up to 2,000 amos. But now I can't, right? So there is positive. I could go to Haver to Grace. And at the same time, I can't go anywhere else. And therefore, it is a negative, right? So Rav Papa is trying to say that what's happening over here is that there is that maybe the reason Rabbi Shua ben Levi said we go with the lenient view. He was talking about Ruvi Chatzeros, which is generally speaking a more lenient type of halacha, but he had to nonetheless come along and say the halachas of Rabbi Yochanan Nuri, because Rabbi Yochanan Nuri is talking about a case of Eretz Chumin where we are more stringent because of certain factors, and that's why he had to spell it all out. Okay, and that's another answer. Rav Ashi is going to give another possible answer as to why Rabbi Shua ben Levi had to spell it out, why we needed both statements. Rav Ashi Amar Itzrich, it was where the 46b1 second column. Itzrich, it's needed. I would have thought Hanimili b'shiyurei eruv, that I would have thought that the law follows the lenient view when it's referring to the remainder of an eruv. Okay, but not when it's talking about the beginning of an eruv. When it's the beginning of an eruv, maybe we don't follow the lenient view. In other words, to establish an eruv, maybe we don't necessarily follow the lenient view. It's only when there's a remainder of an eruv. So what does it mean, remainder versus beginning? Let's see in the Mishnah. We're going to spell it out. So where do we see that we differentiate between the remainder of an eruv and the beginning of an eruv? So it's not as taught in the Mishnah. Okay, it was taught in the Mishnah also in Daf Pei that Amar Rav Yossi. So the Mishnah says that there's a minimum amount of food needed for a ruvi chatzeros. Okay, there's a minimum amount of food. You need an amount for meals in order to be a qualified ruvi chatzeros. So then Rav Yossi comes along. Rav Yossi, b'med v'amurim, when it does this minimum quantity apply? B'tchilas erev, at the beginning of an erev. Aval b'shiyurei erev afilu kolshu. Let's say you set up an erev on Shabbos number 1. Okay, this Shabbos we set up an erev for the city of Baltimore. Great. And then on Shabbos number 2, someone came along. Someone was hungry. Kid saw a box of matzahs and ate through the matzahs and left this much matzah, right? Says Rav Yossi, that's okay. You only need the measurement to start the eruv, but when it's the remainder of the eruv, as long as it was started that amount, as long as there's a little bit left, that's okay. Okay? And
how long? That seems like
sorry?
For how long?
Forever. As long as you started it with proper amounts, it could go on as long as you leave something remaining. Okay, and then Rav Yossi qualifies further. V'lo amru la'arev chatzeros, because when they required an erev chatzeros, not that they required, but when they required, I'm going to add an important word here based on Rashi, when they required the measurement of food for eruv chatzeros, the reason they require that much food, ela kedei shelo l'shakeach toras erev min yitzinokos, so to ensure that children don't forget the law of the erev. Okay, so what does this mean? What this means is that there's a few different types of erev. One is, which one is more common, erev chatzeros or erev tchumen? Chatzeros, right? Because more often, right, tchumen means you want to travel far on Shabbos. Sometimes happens. When was the last time you used the Erev tchumen? Never, right? I used it once in my life, and it was probably a stringency. I probably didn't really have to because whatever. It's a question, right? Leaving Eretz Yisrael, but Erev tchumen is not so common. But let's say so. Rav Yossi is explaining that the reason, that in truth, when it comes to Erev Chatzeros, really the rabbis, if it was just Erev Chatzeros that existed, they wouldn't need this much food. They would just need a shared amount of food shared between them. The reason they have a specific required amount, a larger amount of meals, is because of Eruv tchumen, which is less common, and there you do need amounts. Because what's happening with Erev tchumen, what are you doing? With Erev tchumen, you're trying to establish, this is my residence. Well, your residence needs a specific amount to really be residence. Erev Chatzeros, really what's happening is that we're just trying to share something, create some commonality. You and I could create commonality with anything, right? But when it comes to Erev Tchumen, there's more requirements of, we're trying to really establish a sense of belonging, a sense of this being my home. And therefore, Rav Yossi is explaining that, that the only reason they required a larger amount for 2 meals by Eruv Chatzeros is only because children see, people who don't know will see the Eruv Chatzeros on a regular basis, and they'll think whatever laws apply by Eruv Chatzeros is going to apply Eruv Tchumen. And they saw that had we just said that we only require a little bit for Eruvin Chaseros, then later on in life, someone's going to sit Erev Tchum, and the once in a lifetime Erev Tchum, they're going to sit up and say, well, Erev, how much do I need? Well, I saw from my Erev at home, I just need this much, so I'm going to sit up that much. It's going to be a problem. And therefore, therefore they said, okay, for Erev Chaseros also, you need a much larger amount. But if it whittles down, if some kid came and ate it, and you just have a little bit, it's fine, because really, all you really needed is that much to begin with. Okay, all that is a long way of saying that there is a difference between the beginning of an Erev, where we require more, and the remaining of the Erev require less. Rav Ashi is suggesting that Rav Yeshua ben Levi, when he said that the halacha is following the lenient view by Eruvin, he was talking about this in particular, about remaining amounts of an Erev, which in general we're going to be much more lenient, because once the Erev is established with appropriate requirements, we're going to be more lenient as it goes along, meaning at a later stage, even if it gets less and all that. And therefore, Rav Yeshua ben Levi, when he said the halacha is like the lenient view, he was talking about the remaining of the Erev. In other words, as long as the Erev is set up properly, even if things change, we're going to rule leniently by Erev. But in general, about establishing the Erev, there maybe Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would say, we don't follow the lenient view. And understandably, because again, Rabbi Yeshua, the premise would be that once the Erev is really in place, that's what, all you really needed was a small amount to begin with. And therefore, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi has to spell out the halachas like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in this particular case of a tchum, which is the beginning where you're establishing an Erev for the very first time, as opposed to the remainder. Okay, that would be another way of addressing why Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi has both statements. Okay, now we go into some general rules of who we paskin like. Okay, so we have, I think I mentioned this when we began Eruvin. Eruvin is just, if you were to think of like the meta message of all of Eruvin, is that, the entire discussion over here is really teaching us, in many respects, how do we relate to rabbinic law? Because Eruvin, more than anything else, is all d'rabbanans, right? It's all d'rabbanans, and so you'll find a lot of discussion about like how do we understand the rabbis in general, not just rabbinic law, but how do we understand the rabbis and their place. So what follows over here is a discussion about who do we pass like when we have this person and that person, this person, that person. Who do we follow? Who do we follow? So we're really discussion about the Chazal and their discussions, the arguments in general. Okay, so let's see. Rav Yaakov, Rav Zreika, Amru. Rav Yaakov and Zreika told us the following. We're 46b2. Halachak Rabbi Akiva mechavero. If we ever find Rabbi Akiva arguing with one of his friends, one of his colleagues, okay, so Rameir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, whatever, then we go like Rabbi Akiva. We always default to Rabbi Akiva. Uch Rabbi Yossi mechavei Rav. Rav Yossi, though, even if he's arguing with a group of people, we pass like Rav Yossi. Okay, so in other words, Rav Yossi in some ways is stronger. If Rav Yossi is arguing not just with one colleague, but even a group of colleagues, we would go like Rav Yossi. Uche Rebbe mechavero, and it follows the halacha like Rebbe against one. Like in other words, if we ever see Rebbe arguing with any of his colleagues, we go like Rebbe. Okay, now the Gemara asks, L'mai hilchasa. In other words, how do we interpret that statement? So we'll see there's three different ways of interpreting it. I'm going to use the way Rashi understands the next paragraph. Ravasi Amar Halacha. That this paragraph above, which said Rabbi Akiva over his friends, Rav Yossi over his colleagues in the plural, Rebbe over his colleague. So that is the halacha. In other words, we rule and we explicitly say this out loud. That you should know, the halacha, if you ever see machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and his friends, we go like Rabbi Akiva. Okay? Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Matin. What that means is that we kind of incline. What that means is that the way Rashi understands is that in a situation, when a particular case where it doesn't mean it's a general rule, and it doesn't mean we say this explicitly and out loud, but rather what it means if, let's say, someone comes to you asking you a shaila, and there is a scenario where, based on the factors, you think it would be more appropriate. I don't know, again, there's some particular need, and therefore you want to go like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva against his friend, you'd be allowed to do so. But it doesn't mean we make a general rule. It just means in particular situations, you'd be allowed to go like Rabbi Akiva against his friend, or Rav Yossi against his friends, plural, okay? Rav Yossi, Rabbi Chanina Amar, Nirin. What does Nirin mean? It literally means indicated. The way Rashi understands is that it doesn't mean the halacha is like the above state paragraph. It doesn't mean that the halacha is that we in particular scenarios will do that. What it means is that post facto, it would be okay. After the fact, it would be okay, right? Sometimes the person will come to you and say, okay, I did the following. So you say, okay, listen, next time, don't do that, right? However, do you have to go and, kasher the bowl? Do you have to go ahead and redo what you did? Or, okay, there was what to rely upon, right? So that would be the third opinion, okay? Fine. So that is, again, three possible,
so
yeah.
Do we say that the way you just said it, we don't don't just say it about Rabbi Akiva now. Now you kind of use that to say it in
about
general.
this whole. Well, not in general. Meaning the question is, what did Rav Yaakov now? No, it's not in general because the question is this particular set of rules, principles. What was their function of telling us this? Was their function telling us this is the halacha? Was the function telling us it would be a good fact? You could keep it as a factor. It doesn't mean it's the halacha. You wouldn't state it explicitly, maybe in particular scenarios. Or was it coming to tell you of a very particular thing that after the fact? But that's not going to be true in every case. Meaning it's about these three statements.
Right. So it's just Rabbi. So you're not. You wouldn't say, oh, well, this rabbi says it. They're not trying to say that like after you do something wrong or whatever. Well, this rabbi said it was
correct.
Okay.
It's about these three people, Rabbi Kiva, Rav Yossi, and Rebbe.
Okay,
exactly.
Okay,
just there. Okay. No problem. No, thank you. Okay. So Kalash Nazeh further. Kalash Nazeh Amar Rav Yaakov Re'idi Rav Yochanan. Okay. So Rav Yaakov Re'idi said there Rav Yochanan that what? Rameir Rabbi Yehuda halach Rabbi Yehuda. If you have a dispute between Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Rav Yossi halach Rav Yossi. If you have a dispute between Rav Yehuda and Rav Yossi, the halacha follows Rav Yossi. V'entzarach lomer Rameir Rav Yossi halach Rav Yossi. And obviously the halacha, if it's between Rameir and Rav Yossi, halacha would follow Rav Yossi. Why? Because Hash become Rav Yehuda Leisa. Because Rameir against Rav Yehuda, we said the halacha follows Rav Yehuda. So, and we also said that Rav Yehuda and Rav Yossi, the halacha follows Rav Yossi. So b'mkom Rav Yossi mibayis. So if it's just Rameir against Rav Yossi, so certainly the halacha would follow Rav Yossi, right? You follow that little calculation. Okay. Amar Ravasi, Afani lo made Rav Yossi of Rav Shimon halacha Rav Yossi. Ravasi comes along and adds that Rav Yossi and Rav Shimon, the halacha would follow Rav Yossi as well. To Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan, Rav Yehuda, Rav Shimon halacha Rav Yehuda, because we had a statement saying Rav Yehuda and Rav Shimon, the halacha follows Rav Yehuda. Hash become Rav Yehuda Leisa, and we already established that Rav Yossi we go like Rav Yossi or Rav Yehuda, and you just established that Rav Yehuda, and Rav Shimon, you go like Rav Yehuda, and we know you go like Rav Yossi or Rav Yehuda, so certainly Rav Yehuda, Rav Shimon, who is quote unquote weaker than Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda is weaker than Rav Yossi, so certainly if it's Rav Shimon and Rav Yossi, the halacha would be like Rav Yossi. Ibailahu, Rameir Rav Shimon Mai. What's the halacha if it's Rameir Rav Shimon in a dispute? Who do you go like? Teku, the Gemara says it's not resolved. Okay. Rav Shashia, Leis Nulhani Klali. Rav Shashia comes along and says, these rules are not valid. Okay? He says, yeah, very nice, but we don't actually rule like that. You're trying to give general rules. I'm telling you, we don't. Each case you have to discuss in and of itself. You can't have these sweeping rules that we always follow these particular people. We actually have to, what he argues, we have to analyze each case. Okay? Now, the question is, Mina le Rav Misharshia ha. How does Rav Misharshia know this? In other words, where does Rav Misharshia is clearly coming from somewhere where he says that I will tell you these rules do not apply. So where does he get it from? If you want to say he learned it from our Mishnah, and we call Rav Shimon Omer. Rav Shimon in our Mishnah said, Lamaha Davar Domeh. Right? We had, our Mishnah was talking about a case where we had people started Shabbos and they had their own tchum, and the tchum overlapped where you had three people, one person over here, one person over here, one person over here, overlapping, right? And Rav Shimon said, Lamad Davar Doma. What's this similar to? L'shalosh chateres upsuchos zelazo. You have three courtyards open to one another. Upsuchos sh'rabim. Each courtyard was open to the public domain. If the two outer ones joined in the erev with the middle one, who muterasi mahen, he muterasi mahen, then the middle one is permitted with them, the outer chatzeros. Vehem muterasi mahen, and the outer ones are permitted to carry to and fro with the middle one. Ushtam chitzonos asur, but the ones on the outside are prohibited with one another. Okay, and then the Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria Amar Rav, and it was Rav Chama Bar Guria come along and said halacha Rav Shimon, that we follow Rav Shimon in that Mishnah about this halacha. And the Gemara asks, Duman Paligalei, who argues with Rav Shimon? Okay, so we'll see this Mishnah, we'll see this machlokas a little bit later, but there is a dissenting view, and this dissenting view says no, they can't carry between the chatzeros whatsoever. You're not allowed to share. You're not allowed to unless they're all made at erev together. If you have a case where two of them made an erev or one of them made an erev, with one another, you cannot carry. One opinion says you cannot carry at all until they all make an erev together. So, and Rav Chama Bar Guria comes along and says halacha is like Rav Shimon. Uman Paligalei, and who argues with Rav Shimon? In other words, who is Rav Shimon arguing with that says, that other view? Rav Yehuda. It's Rav Yehuda. Now, how do we know it's Rav Yehuda? The Farshim suggests that Rav Yehuda is the one speaking in the Mishnah before. Bottom line is we establish it's Rav Yehuda he's arguing with, and what happens? And he comes along and says, the halacha is like Rav Shimon over Rav Yehuda. Va'amras, but didn't you just say, as part of the rules, 46b3, Rav Yehuda, Rav Shimon, halacha Rav Yehuda, that when you have Rav Yehuda, Rav Shimon, the halacha follows Rav Yehuda. So, and yet, Rav rules over here, the halacha is like Rav Shimon. Elav shma mina lesnu. Clearly, those principles don't apply. Right? You follow all this? In other words, we have our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we have machlokes between Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda. And Rav ultimately comes along and says, the halacha is like Rav Shimon, which does not follow the principles, because the principles were that if it's Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda, the halacha follows Rav Yehuda. And he just said, the halacha follows Rav Shimon. So therefore, clearly, Rav Sharshia says, maybe this is Rav Sharshia's source, to say that those rules don't apply. Answers the Gemara, my kushya. What kind of question is this? Dilma hecha de itmar. Where it was said explicitly the halacha doesn't follow those rules, then we don't follow those rules. In other words, heicha de lo itmar. But if there isn't a clear ruling, then we default to the general principles. In other words, you can't ask me a question from the fact that it was said explicitly the halacha follows Rav Shimon or Rav Yehuda. All that means, on the contrary, all that means is this is an exceptional case. But when you don't have someone weighing in, and you and I are trying to figure out what the halacha is, well, we'll default to the principles. Therefore, maybe it's not really a question. So the Gemara says, fine, maybe there's another source. Okay, I'm going to interpret this like the way Rashi interprets this. We'll get into this mission a little bit more in a little while. But let's say you have a private town which becomes public. What that means is you have a small town, and then over time, 600,000 people move in. So let's say it's like Lakewood. Okay, so I don't know, 30 years ago, it was like a little tiny little place, and all of a sudden, overnight, it becomes like this mega center. Okay, Ma'arvin es kula. You're allowed to make an eruv through, and now let's assume it doesn't meet all the requirements of being a public domain. In other words, there's 600,000 people living there, but the streets are very narrow. Oh, Lakewood's perfect, okay? That's why they have accidents all the time, is because the street is not zoned for the masses, and so you have like these like tiny little like one street light and like these narrow roads. It's a disaster. Okay, but the bottom line is, because of that, you don't have these wide roads, it will therefore not fulfill the requirements of being a full-fledged public domain, and therefore you would be allowed to make an eruv in Lakewood, okay? Ma'arvin es kula, you're allowed to make an eruv in the whole thing. You're allowed to make an eruv in the whole thing. Great. However, shel rabim and shel yachid. Let's say it was a busy town and it became private. It's the opposites. The city loses its population, but it's therefore perceived, and the Mishnah is going to get to, is that it's perceived as a big place, because it once was, and therefore we always in our mind, we say, oh, it's a big public place. So, Ema Arvin es kula, you don't make an eruv throughout the whole thing, unless you set aside an area outside the eruv. In other words, we want to create a reminder, just in case, let's say, some new mayor comes along and everyone starts investing in the city, and the city now balloons back to where it was. You may, in your mind, start to think that, that you may forget that it's really a larger city, and therefore, in order to ensure that we remember, to remember the halachos of an eruv, and to ensure that it never gets to the size of a large city, which would really, create a reality where an eruv wouldn't work. Therefore, what you do is you set aside an area within the city that is not included in the eruv. Here, how big is that space? In other words, you ensure that there's a small space that's not incorporated into the eruv to remind you of the history, to ensure you don't make any mistakes. So how large is that space? It's the equivalent of the town of Chadasha, which has 50 people living there. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, Abi Shimon Omer. However, Rav Shimon says, okay, Rabbi Shimon Omer, that should be a Rebbe, right? Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rav Shimon disagrees. Shalosh chatzer, shalosh shnei batim. It has to be the size of 3 chatzers containing 2 houses. Now, Rav Shimon is disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda over there. So you have machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon, and we say the halacha follows Rav Shimon. So fine. So Gemara says, and who is disagreeing with Rav Shimon? Rabbi Yehuda. Amras, didn't you say Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Shimon, halacha Rabbi Yehuda? That when there's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, and so Rav, who's telling us the halacha follows Rav Shimon, is disregarding those rules. So this is proving Rav Sharshia's point. So why don't we give the same answer we gave before? My kusha, what's the question? Zilma hachinami, here too. Heichad itzmar. When Rav, or when someone comes along and says, okay, in this particular case, we go like Rav Shimon or Rabbi Yehuda, okay, then we listen to that. The point of those rules were, heicha de lo itmar, where there's no explicit ruling, then we default and follow those principles. Okay, let's stop over here. Have a great day.